Poor girl forced to marry rich heir, what he did on their wedding night broke every expectation. She never imagined her wedding night would begin with her barricading herself in a stranger's guest room, still wearing a $10,000 dress that felt like a beautiful prison. But what happened when Carter Kane finally knocked on that door would shatter every assumption she'd made about rich men, forced marriages, and what it means to be truly seen. Picture this. Nyla Monroe, 26 years old, pressed against an ornate bedroom door in the Kane family mansion, her heart hammering so hard she was certain it could be heard through the mahogany. The silk wedding dress that had felt like armor during the ceremony now clung to her trembling body like a reminder of everything she'd sacrificed for love. Not love for the man she'd just married, but love for the woman who'd raised her when no one else would. The distant sounds of celebration drifted up from the grand ballroom below, where 300 of society's elite toasted a union that felt more like a business transaction than a sacred vow. The weight of her great-grandmother's engagement ring, now resting on her finger, felt heavier than the crushing debt that had forced her into this impossible choice. But there was something else happening in that hallway, something that would change everything. Carter Kane stood outside that very door, his hand raised to knock, his own heart racing with an emotion he couldn't quite name. He'd felt it during their kiss at the altar, that unexpected jolt of electricity that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the woman whose tears he'd glimpsed when she thought no one was looking. What do you think Carter did when he found his new wife crying on their wedding night? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because you might be surprised by how wrong your first guess is. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. Now, to understand how two complete strangers ended up in this moment of reckoning, we need to go back 3 weeks earlier, to a morning that began like any other in Nyla Monroe's exhausting but determined life. The alarm shrieked at 4:45 a.m., just like it had every day for the past 3 years. Nyla's small apartment in the aging complex on Riverside Avenue never quite shook off the chill of winter, and this particular March morning felt especially unforgiving. But she'd learned long ago that complaining about circumstances you couldn't change was a luxury she couldn't afford. By 5:30, she was behind the counter at Sunrise Cafe, her thick dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her uniform pressed despite being 3 years old and showing the wear of countless washing machine cycles. The morning rush was always a blur of impatient faces, complicated coffee orders, and customers who saw right through her as if she were just another piece of equipment. "Large coffee, 2 sugars, no room," barked a man in an expensive suit, not bothering to look up from his phone as he thrust a $20 bill in her direction. This was her world, invisible labor for people who never wondered if she had dreams beyond serving their caffeine addiction. But that particular morning, something different happened. A man approached the counter with a measured stride, his presence commanding attention even in the chaos of the breakfast rush. When Nyla looked up to take his order, their eyes met for just a moment, and something indefinable passed between them. He was tall, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it, and eyes that seemed to see more than most people bothered to look for. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, his voice low and unexpectedly gentle. "And take your time." In the 3 years she'd worked at Sunrise Cafe, no customer had ever told her to take her time. Nyla found herself studying his face as she reached for the coffee pot, noting the exhaustion around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders despite his expensive clothing. He looked like a man carrying the weight of expectations he'd never chosen. As she handed him the steaming cup, their fingers brushed for the briefest moment. The contact sent an unexpected warmth shooting up her arm, and she noticed his sharp intake of breath, as if he'd felt it too. But before either could acknowledge what had just happened, chaos erupted. A woman behind him, impatient with the delay, bumped into his elbow just as he was lifting the cup. Hot coffee splashed across the newspaper he'd been carrying, and Nyla gasped in horror as the dark liquid spread across what looked like important business documents. "Oh no, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, immediately reaching for a towel. "Let me help you with that." But instead of the anger she expected, instead of the demands for a manager or threats of lawsuits that usually followed such accidents, he simply smiled. It was the first genuine smile she'd seen from a customer in months, and it transformed his entire face. "It's not your fault," he assured her, accepting the towel she offered. "These things happen." "But your papers," Nyla insisted, watching the ink blur as he dabbed at the coffee stains. "They look important." He glanced down at the ruined documents, and she caught a flicker of something that might have been relief in his expression. "Sometimes the universe has a way of telling us when we're focusing on the wrong things," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Their eyes met again, and for a moment, the bustling cafe faded away. There was something in his gaze that made her feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in longer than she could remember. But the moment shattered when the impatient woman behind him cleared her throat loudly. "Some of us have places to be," she announced coldly. The spell broken, the man stepped aside, but not before leaving a $10 tip for a $3 cup of coffee. As he walked away, Nyla felt an inexplicable sense of loss, as if something important had just walked out of her life before she'd even understood what it was. She wouldn't see him again for another 2 weeks, but she'd think about those kind eyes and that unexpected smile every day. Little did she know that the man with the coffee-stained newspaper was Carter Kane, heir to a media empire, and that their paths would cross again under circumstances neither of them could have imagined. The rest of Nyla's day followed its predictable pattern. After her shift at Sunrise Cafe ended at 2 p.m., she had exactly 30 minutes to get across town to her second job, cleaning offices in the downtown business district. The work was lonely but honest, and it gave her time to think, to dream about a different life while she scrubbed other people's messes. But that evening, everything changed. Nyla arrived home to find an ambulance parked outside her apartment building, its red and blue lights painting ominous shadows on the walls. Her heart dropped to her stomach as she recognized the paramedics wheeling someone out on a stretcher. Even from a distance, she could see the familiar gray hair, the delicate hands that had braided her hair every morning before school, that had held her when nightmares made sleep impossible. "Mama Ruth," she cried, running toward the stretcher. Her grandmother's eyes fluttered open at the sound of her voice, and she managed a weak smile. "There's my beautiful girl," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of medical equipment. The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency rooms, medical jargon, and forms that required signatures she could barely see through her tears. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months to live, maybe less. Treatment options that cost more than Nyla could earn in 5 years, even working 2 jobs. As she sat in the sterile hospital waiting room at 3 in the morning, staring at medical bills that might as well have been written in a foreign language, Nyla felt the walls of her carefully constructed life crumbling around her. She'd always known that being poor meant having fewer choices, but she'd never imagined it would mean choosing between her pride and the life of the only person who'd ever truly loved her. Meanwhile, across the city in a penthouse office that never slept, Carter Kane sat in a leather chair that cost more than most people's cars, staring out at the city lights and feeling utterly alone. The coffee-stained newspaper from that morning lay in his trash can, but he couldn't stop thinking about the young woman who'd seemed so genuinely distressed by the accident. In his world, everything was calculated, every interaction choreographed for maximum advantage. But her concern had been real, spontaneous, human in a way that felt foreign to his carefully controlled existence. He'd built walls around his heart so high that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone see him as simply a person rather than a bank account with legs. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, yet felt poorer than he'd ever been. His parents' marriage had been a merger disguised as romance, and he'd watched them destroy each other with cold civility and strategic cruelty. He'd sworn he'd never follow that path, but at 30 years old, he was beginning to wonder if he'd have any choice in the matter. His mother, Helena Kane, had been applying increasing pressure for him to marry someone suitable, someone who would enhance the family's social standing and business connections. The conversations always ended the same way, with Helena's barely concealed threats about his inheritance and his position in the company his grandfather had built. That night, as Carter tried unsuccessfully to sleep, he made a decision that would change everything. He was tired of being a puppet in his mother's elaborate social game. If she insisted on an arranged marriage, he would find a way to turn it to his advantage, to help someone who actually needed help rather than someone who simply wanted access to the Kane fortune. He had no idea that fate was already arranging the collision of two desperate worlds, bringing together a woman who'd learned that love meant sacrifice and a man who'd forgotten what love looked like when it wasn't wearing a price tag. The meeting that would change both their lives forever was arranged by Dr. James Thompson, a family friend who'd been treating the Kane family for decades. Helena had approached him about finding a suitable candidate for what she termed a charitable marriage arrangement, something that would generate positive publicity while solving the problem of Carter's stubborn bachelorhood. Dr. Thompson had hesitated at first, uncomfortable with the cold calculation behind Helena's plan. But when he heard about Nyla Monroe's situation through his connections at the hospital, when he learned about a young woman desperately trying to save her grandmother's life while maintaining her dignity, he saw an opportunity to help rather than harm. The meeting took place in Dr. Thompson's office on a gray Thursday afternoon that felt heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. Nyla sat in a chair that probably cost more than her monthly rent, wearing her best dress, which had been her high school graduation outfit 4 years earlier. Across from her, Helena Kane perched on the edge of her seat like a predator evaluating prey, her designer suit and perfect makeup creating an armor of privilege that made Nyla feel exposed and small. Carter sat slightly apart from his mother, his discomfort obvious to everyone except Helena, who was too focused on orchestrating the conversation to notice her son's growing distaste for the entire proceeding. "The arrangement is quite simple," Helena explained, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Carter needs a wife, preferably someone whose circumstances will generate sympathetic media coverage. You need financial assistance for your grandmother's medical care. A mutually beneficial exchange." Nyla's hands clenched in her lap as she fought to maintain her composure. Every word out of Helena's mouth made her feel smaller, cheaper, more like an object to be purchased than a human being with feelings and dreams. "What exactly would this arrangement entail?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the way her heart was racing. "A marriage ceremony, of course. Public appearances as needed. You would live in the family home, attend social functions, play the part of the grateful young woman rescued from poverty by Kane generosity." Helena's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "In return, all of your grandmother's medical bills will be paid, and you'll receive a monthly allowance sufficient to maintain an appropriate lifestyle." The word "appropriate" hung in the air like a judgment, and Nyla felt heat rise in her cheeks. She glanced at Carter, trying to read his expression, but his face was carefully neutral, giving nothing away. "And what happens after?" Nyla asked quietly. "I mean, this can't be permanent." "The contract would be for 2 years initially," Helena replied smoothly. "Renewable if both parties find the arrangement satisfactory." 2 years. 2 years of pretending to be someone else, of living in a world where she would never truly belong, of being grateful for scraps from a table that could feed hundreds. But also 2 years where Mama Ruth would receive the best medical care available, where the woman who'd raised her might actually have a chance to see Nyla build a real life. "I need to think about it," Nyla said finally. Of course, Helena agreed, but her tone suggested that thinking was a luxury Nyla couldn't afford. "But I should mention that your grandmother's condition is quite serious. Time is not on your side." It was then that Carter spoke for the first time since the introductions. "Perhaps we could discuss the terms privately," he said, looking directly at Nyla. "This decision affects both of us." Helena's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose in surprise. "Carter, I hardly think, Mother," he interrupted, his voice carrying a note of authority that Nyla hadn't expected. "I think Miss Monroe and I should have a few minutes to talk without an audience." For a moment, tension crackled in the air between mother and son, a battle of wills that spoke of years of conflict beneath the surface of polite society. Finally, Helena stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. "Very well," she said coldly. "Dr. Thompson and I will wait outside." When the door closed behind them, the silence in the room felt different, less oppressive but more charged with possibility. Carter turned in his chair to face Nyla fully, and she was struck again by the way his eyes seemed to see more than they should. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "My mother has a way of making people feel like commodities rather than human beings." "It's not your fault," Nyla replied, though she appreciated the acknowledgement more than she could express. "Isn't it?" Carter leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, bringing them closer together. "I'm the one who agreed to this charade. I'm the one who's so desperate to escape my mother's matchmaking that I'm willing to enter into a business arrangement disguised as a marriage." There was something in his voice, a vulnerability that she hadn't expected from someone whose family name was synonymous with power and wealth. "Why are you desperate?" she asked softly. Carter was quiet for a long moment, and Nyla thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he were sharing a secret he'd never told anyone. "Have you ever felt like your entire life was planned by someone else? Like every choice you make has to serve someone else's vision of who you should be?" He looked out the window, his profile sharp against the gray afternoon light. "I've spent 30 years trying to be the son my mother wanted, the heir my grandfather envisioned, the businessman the board of directors needed. But I've never been asked what I wanted." Nyla understood that feeling more than he could know. "What do you want?" she asked. Carter turned to look at her then, and the intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. "I want to matter," he said simply. "I want to do something with my life that helps people rather than just accumulating more wealth for the sake of wealth. I want to be someone worth knowing, not just someone worth knowing for what I can provide." The honesty in his voice touched something deep in Nyla's chest, a recognition of shared loneliness that transcended their vastly different circumstances. "If we did this," she said carefully, "what would you expect from me?" "Nothing that you're not willing to give," Carter replied immediately. "I know this sounds naive, but I'd like to think we could be friends. Partners in helping each other get what we need while causing as little harm as possible." Friends. The word hung between them, full of possibility and hope. When was the last time someone had wanted to be her friend without needing something from her first? "I should tell you," Carter continued, "that I was at Sunrise Cafe a couple of weeks ago. You spilled coffee on my newspaper." Nyla's eyes widened in recognition. "That was you? You were so upset about ruining papers that were probably better off in the trash anyway," he said, and she could see a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You cared about a stranger's inconvenience more than most people in my life care about anything real." The memory of that morning, of the unexpected kindness in his eyes, suddenly took on new meaning. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. What would you do if you had to choose between your pride and saving someone you love? Share your thoughts below. These impossible choices shape who we become. 3 days later, Nyla sat beside Mama Ruth's hospital bed, holding her grandmother's hand while machines monitored every breath, every heartbeat. The oncologist had been brutally honest about the prognosis without treatment, and even with the most aggressive care available, the chances weren't good. But some chance was better than none, and Nyla had learned that hope was sometimes the only currency that mattered. "Baby girl," Mama Ruth whispered, her voice weak but determined, "I've lived a good life. Don't you go making yourself into something you're not just for an old woman who's already seen more sunrises than she deserved. You're not old, and you deserve every sunrise and 1,000 more," Nyla replied fiercely, squeezing her grandmother's hand. "Besides, maybe this is exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. Maybe this is how I finally get to take care of you the way you took care of me." Mama Ruth's eyes, still sharp despite her illness, studied her granddaughter's face. And what about love, child? What about finding someone who sees your beautiful heart and loves you for exactly who you are? Nyla thought about Carter's words, about his desire to matter, to be seen as more than just his bank account. Maybe they were both looking for the same thing in different ways. Maybe friendship was a kind of love worth building a life around, even if it wasn't the romantic fairy tale she dreamed about as a girl. Maybe love comes in forms we don't expect, she said finally. Maybe sometimes the best love is the kind that helps people become who they're supposed to be. 2 days later, Nyla signed the marriage contract, her signature shaky but determined. Carter signed it too, but not before adding a handwritten clause that made Dr. Thompson's eyebrows rise and Helena's mouth tighten into a thin line of displeasure. The addition was simple but significant. Both parties reserve the right to end this arrangement at any time if either feels their emotional well-being is being compromised. It was a escape hatch, a recognition that despite the business nature of their agreement, they were still human beings who deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. It was also the first sign that Carter Kane might be very different from what his family's reputation suggested. The wedding was scheduled for the following Saturday, giving them barely a week to prepare for a ceremony that would change both their lives forever. As Nyla walked out of Dr. Thompson's office that afternoon, her mind reeling with the magnitude of what she'd just agreed to, she had no idea that in 6 days, she would find herself pressed against a bedroom door, terrified of what her new husband might expect from her. But she also had no idea that Carter Kane was about to prove that sometimes the most unexpected kindness comes from the places we least expect it, and that real love might just begin with someone asking the simplest but most revolutionary question of all: what do you need? Chapter 2. The week leading up to the wedding passed in a surreal blur of appointments, fittings, and preparations for a ceremony that felt more like an elaborate performance than a sacred vow. Helena Kane took control of every detail with the precision of a military general, transforming what should have been a joyful time into a carefully orchestrated media event designed to maximize the family's charitable image. Nyla found herself swept along in a current she had no power to direct, shuttled from the florist to the caterer to the seamstress like a prop being prepared for a stage production. The Kane family's influence reached into every corner of the wedding industry, and vendors who would normally require months of advance notice suddenly found themselves available at a moment's notice. The dress fitting was perhaps the most surreal experience of all. Nyla stood on a raised platform in an exclusive bridal boutique that she never could have imagined entering under normal circumstances, while 3 seamstresses circled her like artists perfecting a masterpiece. The gown was everything a girl could dream of, layers of silk and lace that seemed to float around her body, transforming her from a working-class young woman into something that belonged in a fairy tale. But as she stared at her reflection in the 3-way mirror, Nyla felt like she was watching herself disappear. The woman looking back at her was beautiful, elegant, sophisticated, but she was also a stranger. This wasn't Nyla Monroe, who served coffee at dawn and scrubbed floors at night. This was someone playing a role, wearing a costume that cost more than she'd ever owned in her entire life. Stunning, Helena declared from her position on a velvet chair, surveying the result with the critical eye of someone evaluating an investment. The photographers will love this. Pure transformation narrative, rags to riches with a generous family providing the opportunity. Each word felt like a small wound, a reminder that Nyla's worth in this arrangement was entirely tied to how she could serve the Kane family's image. She caught the eye of one of the seamstresses, a kind-looking older woman who seemed to sense her discomfort. "You look beautiful, honey," the woman whispered as she adjusted the train. "That young man of yours is going to forget how to breathe when he sees you." The kindness in her voice was almost Nyla's undoing. She blinked back tears that threatened to ruin the makeup trial they'd completed an hour earlier, focusing on the one thing that made this all bearable. Mama Ruth was responding well to the new treatment regimen, and for the first time in weeks, there was hope in her doctor's voice when he discussed her progress. Meanwhile, Carter was dealing with his own version of wedding preparation hell. His bachelor party, if it could be called that, consisted of a dinner with business associates who spent the evening discussing market projections and merger opportunities. His best man was Dylan, his younger brother, who had returned from studying abroad just in time to witness what he kept referring to as Carter's noble sacrifice. "I still can't believe you're going through with this," Dylan said as they walked through Central Park the evening before the wedding, trying to escape the suffocating atmosphere of family expectations. "Mother's really outdone herself this time." "It's not as calculating as it sounds," Carter replied, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was trying to convince. "Nyla seems like a genuinely good person who's in an impossible situation. If I can help her while getting Mother off my back about marriage, everyone wins." Dylan stopped walking and turned to face his older brother. "And what about love? What about finding someone who actually wants to be with you for who you are, not what you can provide?" The question hit closer to home than Carter wanted to admit. At 30 years old, he'd had relationships, but they'd all followed the same pattern. Women attracted to his name, his wealth, his social position, but never seeming particularly interested in the man behind all of those external markers. He'd begun to wonder if authentic love was even possible for someone in his position. "Maybe love is overrated," he said finally. "Maybe compatibility and mutual respect are more realistic goals." Dylan shook his head. "You don't believe that? I've seen the way you look at couples who are genuinely in love. You want that connection just as much as anyone else." Carter did want it, desperately, but wanting something and believing it was possible were two different things entirely. Tomorrow he would marry a woman he barely knew, and while he hoped they could build something real together, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was setting himself up for another relationship built on transaction rather than genuine feeling. That night, unable to sleep, Carter found himself wandering the halls of the family mansion. He'd grown up in these rooms, but they'd never felt like home, more like a museum dedicated to Kane family achievements. His footsteps led him inevitably to the library, the one room in the house where he'd always felt peaceful. He wasn't expecting to find anyone else there, certainly not Nyla, curled up in his grandfather's favorite reading chair with a book of poetry open in her lap. She looked up when he entered, startled but not afraid, and he was struck again by how genuinely beautiful she was when she wasn't trying to meet anyone else's expectations. "I hope you don't mind," she said, closing the book and starting to stand. "Helena said I could explore the house, and I've always loved libraries." "Please, don't get up," Carter said quickly, moving to the bookshelf nearest her chair. "What were you reading?" Nyla held up the slim volume, and he could see it was a collection of Maya Angelou's poetry. "I know it probably seems silly, reading poetry the night before my wedding, but her words have always helped me feel stronger when I'm scared." "It doesn't seem silly at all," Carter replied, settling into the chair across from her. "Which poem?" "Phenomenal Woman," Nyla said softly, and then, to his surprise, she began to recite from memory. "It's in the reach of my arms, the span of my hips, the stride of my step, the curl of my lips. I'm a woman phenomenally. Phenomenal woman, that's me." Her voice carried conviction despite her obvious nervousness, and Carter found himself seeing her differently. Not as the charity case his mother had presented her as, not as the desperate young woman who'd been forced into an impossible choice, but as someone with inner strength and dignity that couldn't be bought or sold. "That's always been one of my favorites too," he said when she finished. "My grandfather used to say that real wealth isn't what you own, it's who you are when everything else is stripped away." "Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man," Nyla replied. "He was. He would have liked you, I think. He never had much patience for people who judged others based on their bank accounts." Carter paused, choosing his words carefully. "Nyla, I want you to know that tomorrow doesn't have to change who you are. Helena may have orchestrated this arrangement, but that doesn't mean you have to lose yourself in the process." The kindness in his voice, the way he said her name like it mattered, made something tight in Nyla's chest begin to loosen. "I keep wondering if I'm making a terrible mistake," she admitted. "Not about helping Mama Ruth, I'd do anything for her, but about dragging you into my problems. You're not dragging me anywhere I don't want to go, Carter assured her. If anything, you're helping me break free from a pattern that was slowly suffocating me. My mother has been arranging my life since I was old enough to attend social functions. At least this time, I had some say in the choice. They talked for another hour, discovering shared loves of books and music, learning about each other's dreams beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. Nyla told him about her plans to eventually go back to school, maybe study literature or social work. Carter revealed his secret ambition to use the family's media influence for investigative journalism that actually made a difference in people's lives. When they finally parted ways, both felt something shifting between them, a foundation of understanding that hadn't existed before. As Nyla walked back to her room, she found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this marriage wouldn't be the prison sentence she'd feared. And Carter, settling into his own bed for what little remained of the night, realized that for the first time in months, he was actually looking forward to his wedding day. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed designed for new beginnings. The Kane family estate had been transformed into something from a magazine spread, with white roses and elegant drapery creating an atmosphere of refined romance. Nyla's preparation took place in Helena's former suite, now temporarily converted into a bridal preparation area. Rosa Fernandez, the head housekeeper, had appointed herself as Nyla's unofficial guardian for the day, shooing away overeager stylists and ensuring that her new young mistress actually ate something before the ceremony. You need to keep your strength up, Mija, Rosa said, pressing a cup of herbal tea into Nyla's hands. Big day ahead, and you'll regret it if you faint at the altar. Rosa had been with the Kane family for 15 years, and she'd seen enough society weddings to know the difference between genuine joy and elaborate performance. There was something about this young woman that reminded her of her own daughter, a quiet dignity that couldn't be dimmed by circumstances. As the final touches were applied to Nyla's hair and makeup, Helena swept into the room like a force of nature, her own outfit carefully chosen to photograph well while ensuring she wouldn't be outshone by the bride. The photographer wants some candid shots of the preparation, Helena announced, and suddenly the room was full of additional people with cameras and lighting equipment. Remember, we want to capture the transformation narrative. Before and after, struggle and triumph. Nyla felt herself tensing as the cameras began clicking, the intimate process of getting ready becoming a performance for strangers who would turn her most vulnerable moments into publicity material. But then Rosa appeared at her elbow, positioning herself between Nyla and the most intrusive photographer. Enough pictures, Rosa declared firmly. The bride needs a few minutes of peace before the ceremony. Helena looked ready to argue, but something in Rosa's expression made her reconsider. Fine. But we need you downstairs in 20 minutes. The guests are arriving. When the room finally cleared, leaving just Nyla and Rosa, the older woman gently adjusted Nyla's veil and looked at her with maternal concern. That boy of theirs is a good one, Rosa said quietly. Different from his mother, thank God. He's got his grandfather's heart, even if he tries to hide it sometimes. How can you tell? Nyla asked, genuinely curious. 20 years in this house, you learn to see past the surface. He brings his coffee cup to the kitchen himself instead of leaving it for staff. He remembers birthdays and asks about our families. Little things that show character. Rosa smiled. And yesterday, he specifically asked me to make sure you felt welcome and supported today. A man who doesn't care about his bride doesn't think of details like that. The knowledge that Carter had been thinking about her comfort, that he'd taken steps to ensure she wouldn't feel alone today, settled some of the butterflies in Nyla's stomach. Maybe this partnership they were building could become something real after all. Downstairs, Carter was experiencing his own version of pre-wedding nerves. The great room had been filled with 300 guests, most of whom he recognized as business associates, social connections, or people whose presence would look good in the society pages. Very few were there because they actually cared about his happiness. Dylan appeared at his side, impeccable in his role as best man but clearly uncomfortable with the circus atmosphere surrounding the ceremony. "How are you holding up?" Dylan asked quietly. "Like I'm about to participate in the most expensive performance of my life," Carter replied, adjusting his tie for the third time in as many minutes. "You know you can still change your mind," Dylan said. "We could walk out of here right now, go grab a beer somewhere normal, and pretend this was all a very elaborate nightmare." For a moment, Carter was tempted. The easy escape, the return to his familiar life of controlled solitude and managed expectations. But then he thought about Nyla in the library last night, the way her voice had carried strength and hope even while admitting her fears. He thought about her grandmother, fighting for her life in a hospital bed, and about the chance to do something genuinely meaningful with his privilege. "I'm not changing my mind," he said firmly. "This might not be a conventional beginning, but that doesn't mean it can't become something real." The wedding march began, and Carter took his position at the altar, his heart rate accelerating as he waited for his first glimpse of his bride. When the doors opened and Nyla appeared, his breath caught in his throat. She was absolutely radiant, the gown transforming her into something ethereal while somehow highlighting rather than hiding her natural beauty. But it was her expression that affected him most, the quiet courage in her eyes as she walked down the aisle alone, having chosen to give herself away rather than be given by someone else. As she approached the altar, their eyes met and held, and Carter felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than attraction or admiration. This was the moment he realized that whatever had started as a business arrangement was already becoming something far more complicated and infinitely more precious. The ceremony proceeded with the traditional vows, words about love and honor and cherishing that felt strange coming from the mouths of two people who barely knew each other. But when the minister reached the moment everyone was waiting for, when he pronounced them husband and wife and invited Carter to kiss his bride, time seemed to slow to a crystalline stillness. Carter stepped closer to Nyla, close enough to see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breath quickened as he raised his hands to gently frame her face. He'd intended the kiss to be brief, appropriate, the sort of polite gesture expected at a society wedding. But the moment their lips met, everything changed. The kiss was supposed to be performative, a quick brush of lips for the photographers and guests. Instead, it became something electric, a connection that sent heat racing through both their bodies and made the world around them fade into irrelevance. Nyla's hands found their way to Carter's chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms, while his thumbs traced gentle circles on her cheeks. They might have kissed for seconds or minutes, neither could tell, but when they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, staring at each other with something approaching wonder. The applause from their guests seemed to come from very far away, and Carter realized that what he'd assumed would be the most artificial moment of the entire ceremony had somehow become the most real. As they turned to face their guests as husband and wife, Nyla's hand tucked securely in the crook of Carter's arm, both were grappling with the same startling realization. The attraction humming between them wasn't part of the script Helena had written, wasn't something that could be controlled or managed or explained away as gratitude or convenience. It was real, and it was powerful, and it was about to complicate their carefully planned arrangement in ways neither of them was prepared for. The reception that followed was everything Helena had envisioned, a flawless display of Kane family hospitality and social prominence. But for Carter and Nyla, the evening passed in a haze of shared glances and brief touches, each interaction charged with the memory of that unexpected kiss and the promise of a wedding night that suddenly felt far more significant than either had anticipated. As the last guest departed and the staff began cleaning up the remnants of their celebration, Nyla found herself standing in the foyer of what was now her home, still wearing her wedding dress but feeling more nervous than she had all day. The real test of their arrangement was about to begin, and neither she nor Carter had any idea what to expect from each other when the performance finally ended and they were left alone with the reality of what they just committed to. The mansion felt different with all the guests gone, quieter but somehow more charged with possibility. As Carter loosened his tie and Nyla gathered the train of her dress to navigate the grand staircase, both were acutely aware that they were about to discover whether the spark they'd felt during their kiss was real enough to build a marriage on, or whether it had been nothing more than the product of an emotionally charged moment that would never be repeated. What happened next would determine not just the success of their arrangement, but the entire trajectory of their lives together. Chapter 3 The wedding night that would break every expectation began not with romance, but with terror. Nyla stood in what she'd assumed was a guest room, having fled there the moment they'd arrived upstairs, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The $10,000 wedding dress that had made her feel like a princess during the ceremony now felt like a beautiful prison, the corset bodice making it difficult to breathe as panic began to set in. She'd thought she was prepared for this moment. She'd told herself that physical intimacy was just another part of the arrangement, another role to play in exchange for Mama Ruth's life. But standing alone in that opulent bedroom, surrounded by furniture that cost more than most people's cars, the reality of what she'd agreed to hit her with crushing force. She was a stranger in a stranger's house, wearing a stranger's ring, married to a man whose touch had awakened something in her that she hadn't expected and wasn't sure she could handle. The kiss at the altar had been a revelation and a complication, proving that her attraction to Carter wasn't something she could simply compartmentalize as part of their business arrangement. The knock on the door, when it came, was gentle but decisive. Nyla's entire body tensed as she heard Carter's voice through the mahogany. "Nyla? May I come in?" She couldn't answer. Couldn't move. Couldn't do anything but stand there with her back pressed against the door like it was the only thing keeping her from drowning. When Carter heard no response, he tried again, his voice softer this time, tinged with something that sounded almost like concern. "I just want to talk. That's all." Still, she couldn't make herself speak. Every horror story she'd ever heard about arranged marriages, every assumption she'd made about wealthy men who treated women like possessions, came flooding back to paralyze her completely. It was then that Carter did something that would change the entire trajectory of their relationship. Instead of using his physical strength to enter the room, instead of demanding his rights as her husband, instead of any of the behaviors Nyla had been bracing herself for, he simply sat down on the floor outside her door. "I'm going to sit here for a while," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the wood. "You don't have to say anything or do anything. I just want you to know that you're not alone." For several minutes, neither of them spoke. Nyla remained frozen against the door, while Carter sat in the hallway of his own home, still wearing his wedding tuxedo, giving a terrified young woman the space she needed to breathe. Finally, Carter's voice came again, gentle and patient. "I think I know what you're afraid of," he said. "And I want you to know that those fears, whatever they are, they're not going to happen. Not tonight, not ever, unless and until you want them to." Something in his tone, the complete absence of demand or expectation, began to penetrate Nyla's panic. Slowly, carefully, she turned around and pressed her ear to the door. "I've been thinking about that kiss," Carter continued, and she could hear something almost vulnerable in his voice. "I don't think either of us expected it to be what it was. But whatever that meant, whatever it means going forward, it doesn't change the fact that this arrangement is about helping each other, not about anyone taking anything from anyone else." Nyla found her voice at last, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "Do what?" Carter asked gently. "Any of it. Be married. Live in this world. Be someone's wife when I don't even know who I am myself." There was a long pause, and then Carter said something that would stay with Nyla for the rest of her life. "What do you need right now? Not what you think I expect, not what Helena told you was required, but what do you actually need to feel safe and comfortable tonight?" The question was so unexpected, so completely different from anything she'd anticipated, that Nyla felt tears begin to slide down her cheeks. When was the last time someone had asked her what she needed? When was the last time her comfort had been anyone's priority? "I need," she began, then stopped, not sure how to articulate the tangle of emotions in her chest. "Take your time," Carter said softly. "I need to get out of this dress," she said finally. "I need to wash off this makeup and take down this hair and remember who I am underneath all of this." "Rosa left some comfortable clothes in the armoire," Carter replied. "And there's a bathroom through that door on the left where you can have all the privacy you need." "And then?" Nyla asked, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself. "And then, if you want company, we could sit and talk. Get to know each other a little better. If you'd rather be alone tonight, that's fine too. I have a guest room down the hall where I can sleep." The relief that flooded through Nyla was so intense it nearly buckled her knees. "You would do that? Sleep in a different room?" "Nyla," Carter said, and she could hear him shifting position outside the door, "this marriage may have started as a business arrangement, but you are not a business transaction. You're a person with feelings and fears and the right to make choices about your own body and your own life. I hope someday you'll trust me enough to share more of yourself with me, but that day doesn't have to be today." For the first time since she'd fled to this room, Nyla felt like she could breathe properly. Slowly, she turned the lock and opened the door. Carter was indeed sitting on the floor, his back against the opposite wall, his bow tie undone and hanging loose around his neck. When he saw her tear-stained face, his expression filled with such genuine concern that Nyla felt something in her chest begin to crack open. "Are you okay?" he asked, rising gracefully to his feet. "I think I might be," she replied, surprised to realize it was true. Carter smiled then, the same warm, genuine smile she remembered from the coffee shop, and held out his hand. "Come on, let's get you comfortable." An hour later, Nyla emerged from the bathroom transformed. Gone was the elaborate wedding gown, replaced by soft cotton pajamas that Rosa had thoughtfully provided. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, her face scrubbed clean of the professional makeup, and for the first time all day, she looked like herself again. Carter had changed too, trading his formal tuxedo for jeans and a simple sweater, and the casual clothes somehow made him seem more approachable, more like the man who had spoken so gently through her bedroom door. They settled in the sitting area of the master suite, a comfortable arrangement of chairs and a sofa positioned near the fireplace. Carter had started a small fire while she'd been changing, and the warm light created an atmosphere of intimacy without pressure. "Better?" he asked as she curled up in one of the armchairs, tucking her feet beneath her. "Much," Nyla replied, and meant it. "Thank you for being patient with me." "You don't need to thank me for treating you like a human being," Carter said softly. "That should be the minimum expectation, not something worthy of gratitude." They talked for hours that night, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about the future. Nyla told him about growing up with Mama Ruth, about the way her grandmother had worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat while never making Nyla feel like a burden. Carter shared memories of his grandfather, the only person in his family who had seemed to see him as more than a future CEO, who had encouraged his interest in literature and social justice. He used to say that wealth was a responsibility, not a privilege, Carter explained, staring into the fire. That if you had resources, you had an obligation to use them to make the world better, not just to accumulate more resources. "Mama Ruth always said something similar," Nyla replied. "She'd tell me that it didn't matter how much or how little you had, what mattered was how you treated people who couldn't do anything for you in return." "Smart woman," Carter said. "I'd like to meet her properly sometime, when she's feeling better." The casual mention of the future, the assumption that they would still be in each other's lives when Mama Ruth recovered, sent a warm flutter through Nyla's chest. For the first time since signing that contract, she began to think that maybe this arrangement wouldn't be the temporary prison sentence she'd feared. As the fire burned lower and the clock on the mantel chimed midnight, exhaustion finally began to catch up with both of them. But neither wanted to break the spell of this unexpected connection, this feeling of being truly seen and understood by someone who had been a stranger just hours before. "I should let you get some sleep," Carter said finally, though he made no move to leave. "You don't have to go," Nyla said quickly, then blushed at her own boldness. "I mean, this is your room. Your bed. I should be the one to, this is your room now too," Carter interrupted gently. "Your bed, your home, your choice about who sleeps where." The word home hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility and hope. Nyla looked around the beautiful room with fresh eyes, trying to imagine herself belonging here, being welcome here. Would it be weird if... She began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was thinking. "If what?" Carter encouraged. "If we both stayed here tonight? Not for... I mean, just to sleep. But it's such a big bed, and after everything today, I don't really want to be alone." Carter's smile was soft and understanding. "It wouldn't be weird at all. Whatever makes you feel comfortable." And so began the most chaste and yet intimate night of either of their lives. They lay on opposite sides of the enormous king-sized bed, fully clothed and maintaining careful distance, but talking quietly in the darkness about everything and nothing until sleep finally claimed them both. When Nyla woke the next morning, she found a note on Carter's pillow explaining that he'd gotten up early to handle some business calls but that breakfast would be waiting for her whenever she was ready. The thoughtfulness of the gesture, the way he'd anticipated her possible anxiety about waking up alone in a strange place, was just another small kindness that began building the foundation of trust between them. The days that followed established a rhythm that neither had expected but both found surprisingly comfortable. Carter gave Nyla space to explore the mansion and find her place within it, while Rosa took it upon herself to help the new Mrs. Kane navigate the complex social dynamics of the household staff. "The key is to be yourself," Rosa advised as she showed Nyla around the kitchen one morning. "Don't try to be what you think a rich man's wife should be. Mr. Carter, he's got enough fake people in his life. What he needs is someone real." Nyla discovered that Carter had been telling the truth when he'd claimed to be different from his mother's vision of him. He brought his own coffee cup to the kitchen each morning instead of leaving it for staff to collect. He knew the names of every person who worked in the house and asked about their families with genuine interest. He read voraciously, everything from literary fiction to investigative journalism, and his shelves were filled with books about social justice and ethical business practices. More surprisingly, she learned that Carter had been quietly using his family's wealth for charitable causes that Helena knew nothing about. Scholarships for underprivileged students, funding for women's shelters, anonymous donations to families struggling with medical bills. It was a side of him that he kept carefully hidden from his mother's scrutiny, afraid that she would find ways to turn even his charitable impulses into public relations opportunities. "I've been thinking about starting my own foundation," he confided to Nyla one evening as they shared dinner in the smaller dining room rather than the formal one Helena preferred. "Something focused on educational opportunities for kids who are aging out of the foster system. But Mother would want to turn it into a society event, complete with galas and photo opportunities, and that's not what those kids need." "What do they need?" Nyla asked, genuinely curious. "Mentorship. Real support systems. People who care about their success for its own sake, not because it makes good press." Carter set down his fork and looked at her intently. "You'd be good at that kind of work. You understand what it's like to have to fight for opportunities that other people take for granted." The conversation planted a seed in Nyla's mind, the beginning of a vision for how she might use her new position to actually make a difference rather than simply being a decorative addition to Carter's life. It was the first time since agreeing to the marriage that she'd felt excited about their future together rather than simply resigned to it. Their first real test came 2 weeks after the wedding, when Helena insisted they attend a charity gala together. It would be their first public appearance as a married couple, and Helena made it clear that their performance would be crucial to establishing the narrative she wanted to build around their union. "Remember, you're the grateful young woman who's been given a second chance at life," Helena instructed Nyla during a pre-event briefing. "Gracious but not overly familiar. Appreciative but dignified. And for God's sake, don't mention your background unless someone specifically asks. The gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a glittering affair where the cost of a single table could have funded Mama Ruth's cancer treatment for months. Nyla felt overwhelmed by the opulence, the casual display of wealth that surrounded her, but Carter never left her side, introducing her to people with genuine warmth and deflecting intrusive questions about their whirlwind romance. It was during the cocktail hour that they encountered Melissa O'Neill for the first time. Melissa was everything Nyla had feared she'd be: sophisticated, beautiful, completely at ease in this rarefied social atmosphere. She approached their group with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her place in the world, her smile bright and seemingly genuine. "Carter, darling," she said, reaching up to kiss his cheek in the European fashion she'd adopted during her time abroad. "You look wonderful. Marriage suits you." "Thank you, Melissa," Carter replied politely, his arm tightening almost imperceptibly around Nyla's waist. "I'd like you to meet my wife, Nyla. Nyla, this is Melissa O'Neill, an old friend." The way Melissa's eyes assessed Nyla was subtle but thorough, taking in her simple black dress, her minimal jewelry, the way she stood slightly behind Carter as if seeking his protection from the scrutiny of the crowd. "It's lovely to meet you," Melissa said, her tone warm but somehow condescending. "I've heard so much about your story. How romantic that Carter swept you off your feet so quickly." There was something in the way she said "story" that made Nyla's cheeks burn with embarrassment. She could feel the attention of the nearby guests, their curiosity about the Kane family's latest charity case barely concealed behind polite smiles. "Actually," Carter said, his voice carrying a note of steel that Nyla had never heard before, "I'm the lucky one. Nyla has brought more authenticity and joy into my life in 3 weeks than I've experienced in years." The declaration was unexpected and fierce, a public claiming that went far beyond the requirements of their arrangement. Nyla looked up at Carter in surprise, seeing something in his expression that made her heart skip a beat. When he looked down at her, his smile was soft and genuine, and she felt that same electric connection that had sparked between them during their wedding kiss. It was in that moment, surrounded by a crowd of people who saw their marriage as either a business transaction or a fairy tale rescue, that Nyla realized something that both thrilled and terrified her. Somewhere between that first conversation through a locked door and this public declaration of her worth, she had begun to fall in love with her husband. The realization should have been frightening, given the uncertain foundation of their relationship. Instead, as she saw the warmth in Carter's eyes and felt the protective strength of his arm around her, it felt like coming home to a place she'd never known she was looking for. The evening continued around them, a swirl of conversation and champagne and the subtle social maneuvering that defined high society gatherings. But for Nyla and Carter, something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer two strangers helping each other out of difficult circumstances. They were becoming partners, allies, and possibly something much deeper than either had dared to hope for when they'd signed their names to that contract just a month ago. When they returned home that night, they fell back into their comfortable routine of late-night conversations by the fireplace. But there was a new awareness between them, a recognition that the feelings developing weren't part of their original arrangement but might be the most important part of their future together. "Thank you," Nyla said as they prepared for bed, "for what you said tonight. About authenticity and joy." Carter paused in the doorway to the bathroom, turning to look at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I meant every word," he said quietly. "You've changed something for me, Nyla. Something I didn't even realize was missing until you brought it back." As they settled into their now familiar routine of sharing the bed while maintaining respectful distance, both were acutely aware that the space between them felt charged with new possibility. They were still learning each other, still building the trust that would either sustain or destroy their unconventional marriage. But for the first time since this all began, both of them were beginning to believe that what they were building might be strong enough to last a lifetime. The foundation of genuine affection and mutual respect they'd established was about to be tested by forces beyond their control, but tonight, in the quiet intimacy of their shared space, it felt like the beginning of something beautiful rather than the end of something that had never really begun. What neither of them realized was that their growing connection hadn't gone unnoticed by Helena Kane, and that their happiness was about to become a threat that she would stop at nothing to eliminate. Chapter 4. The first sign that their growing happiness had become a problem came disguised as an invitation to Sunday brunch. Helena Kane had been watching her son and his new wife with increasing concern over the past month. What had begun as a perfectly controlled arrangement was developing into something far more complicated and dangerous to her carefully laid plans. She'd expected Carter to maintain his emotional distance, to treat the marriage as the business transaction it was supposed to be. Instead, she'd observed genuine affection blooming between them, witnessed moments of connection that had nothing to do with duty or obligation. The brunch was held in the mansion's sunroom, a beautiful space overlooking the rose garden where Helena had staged many important family discussions over the years. The guest list was small but deliberately chosen. Helena herself, Carter and Nyla, Dylan who had been summoned back from a business trip, and two couples from Helena's inner circle whose opinions carried weight in their social sphere. Nyla arrived wearing a simple but elegant dress that Carter had helped her choose from the wardrobe Helena had insisted on purchasing for her. She'd been nervous about the gathering, sensing an undercurrent of tension she couldn't quite identify, but Carter's presence beside her had given her confidence. The conversation began pleasantly enough, with discussions of upcoming social events and charitable commitments. But Nyla began to notice the subtle ways Helena directed questions toward her, each one designed to highlight her lack of experience with their lifestyle. "Nyla, dear, what are your thoughts on the Metropolitan Opera's upcoming season?" Helena asked with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I assume you've had the opportunity to develop an appreciation for classical music?" "I haven't attended the opera yet," Nyla replied honestly, "but I've always loved music. I grew up listening to everything from jazz to gospel to classical radio." "How eclectic," Helena murmured, the word carrying just enough disdain to sting without being overtly rude. "Perhaps Carter can arrange for some cultural education. It's so important for family members to share common interests." Carter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he kept his voice level. "Nyla's musical knowledge is actually quite impressive. She introduced me to several artists I'd never heard of." "I'm sure she did," Helena replied, her tone suggesting that this wasn't necessarily a good thing. The pattern continued throughout the meal, with Helena finding increasingly creative ways to emphasize Nyla's differences from their social circle. Comments about travel destinations Nyla had never visited, references to social customs she wasn't familiar with, discussions of family connections and shared histories that pointedly excluded her. But it was when the conversation turned to future plans that Helena revealed her true intentions. "I've been thinking about Carter's position with the company," she said casually, cutting her eggs Benedict with surgical precision. "The board has expressed some concerns about the recent changes in his personal life." Carter's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What kind of concerns?" "Nothing serious, of course. But there are questions about focus, about priorities. Some members worry that domestic distractions might affect your judgment on important decisions." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. Nyla felt her cheeks burn with shame and anger as she realized she was being characterized as a domestic distraction that threatened Carter's professional competence. "My marriage has had absolutely no negative impact on my work," Carter said firmly. "If anything, I've been more motivated and creative in the past month than I've been in years." Helena's smile was razor-sharp. "I'm sure that's how it feels to you, darling. But perception matters in business. The board needs to have confidence that their CEO's attention is fully committed to the company's interests." "What exactly are you suggesting, Mother?" Dylan interjected, his own discomfort with the conversation obvious. "Simply that Carter might want to consider how his personal choices affect his professional standing," Helena replied smoothly. "A trial separation, perhaps. Just to demonstrate where his true priorities lie." The silence that followed was deafening. Nyla felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, replaced by something toxic and suffocating. Around the table, the other guests studied their plates with the fascinated horror of people watching a car accident. A trial separation from my wife of 5 weeks? Carter's voice was dangerously quiet. Based on the concerns of board members who have yet to voice these concerns directly to me? Don't be dramatic, Carter, Helena said dismissively. It would be temporary. Just long enough to reassure everyone that you haven't lost sight of what's truly important. And what's truly important, Mother? Carter asked, his control beginning to fray. Maintaining the approval of people who value money over human connection? Sacrificing my personal happiness for the sake of stock prices? I'm talking about your legacy, Helena snapped, her own mask beginning to slip. Your grandfather built this company from nothing. Your father died trying to expand it. And you're willing to risk it all for a woman you've known for 6 weeks? The accusation hung in the air like poison, and Nyla felt every eye in the room turn to her. She was the outsider, the threat, the woman who had somehow enchanted the Kane heir into forgetting his responsibilities. The shame was overwhelming, made worse by the tiny voice in her head that whispered Helena might be right. Excuse me, Nyla said quietly, standing from the table with as much dignity as she could muster. I think I should go. Nyla, wait, Carter began, but she was already walking away, desperate to escape before the tears she was holding back began to fall. She made it to the library before breaking down completely, sinking into the same chair where she'd sat reading poetry on the night before their wedding. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was hiding in the same place where she'd first begun to hope that their arrangement might become something real. Carter found her there 20 minutes later, his own composure hanging by a thread. The brunch had ended abruptly after Nyla's departure, with Helena's carefully chosen witnesses departing in uncomfortable silence while Dylan had cornered their mother for what sounded like a heated conversation. I'm sorry, Carter said simply, settling into the chair across from her just as he had that first night. My mother was inexcusably cruel. Was she wrong, though? Nyla asked through her tears. Am I a distraction? Are you going to lose everything you've worked for because of me? The only thing I'm in danger of losing is my sanity if I have to keep pretending that my mother's opinion matters more than my own happiness, Carter replied fiercely. Nyla, look at me. When she finally met his eyes, she saw an intensity there that took her breath away. You are not a distraction. You are not a mistake. You are the best thing that has happened to me in longer than I can remember, and I will not let anyone, including my mother, make you feel otherwise. His words should have comforted her, but instead they made her feel worse. But what if she's right about the board? What if your position really is at risk? Then I'll find another position, Carter said without hesitation. There are other companies, other ways to use my skills. But there's only one you. And I'm not giving you up to appease people who see relationships as strategic assets. The declaration was everything Nyla could have hoped for, but it also terrified her. She'd entered this marriage to save Mama Ruth's life, not to destroy Carter's future. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Have you ever felt like an outsider in a situation where everyone else belonged? Tell us about a time when you had to prove your worth. Your experiences matter to this community. Over the following weeks, Helena's campaign to undermine Nyla's place in the family intensified. Invitations to family events somehow failed to reach her. Plans were made and changed without consultation. Social functions were scheduled that highlighted skills and knowledge Nyla lacked, always with Helena's sympathetic commentary about how difficult it must be to adapt to such different circumstances. But Helena's most effective weapon turned out to be Melissa O'Neill. Melissa had returned from Europe with impeccable timing, arriving just as Helena was looking for ways to remind Carter of what he was supposedly missing. She began appearing at social events with increasing frequency, always perfectly dressed, always saying exactly the right thing, always representing the life Carter could have had if he'd made different choices. She's everything I'm not, Nyla confessed to Rosa one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen garden, a project that had become Nyla's refuge from the social pressures of her new life. Sophisticated, educated, born to this world. Sometimes I think Carter sees her and realizes what he gave up. That girl? Rosa snorted dismissively. She's beautiful, I'll give you that, but she's got the emotional depth of a teaspoon. Mr. Carter, he needs someone real, someone who challenges him to be better than he thought he could be. How can you be so sure? Nyla asked, grateful for Rosa's loyalty but uncertain whether it was based on genuine insight or simple kindness. Because I've watched him these past weeks, Rosa replied, her weathered hands gentle with the tomato seedlings they were transplanting. I've seen him laugh more, care more, fight more passionately for things that matter. That's not the behavior of a man who's settling for second best. Rosa's words were comforting, but they couldn't entirely dispel Nyla's growing insecurities. Especially when Melissa began finding reasons to visit the house, ostensibly to see Helena but always managing to encounter Carter in the process. The visits were perfectly innocent on the surface, old friends catching up on shared memories and mutual acquaintances. But there was an intimacy to their conversations, a shorthand born of years of shared experiences, that made Nyla feel like an intruder in her own home. Do you remember that summer we spent in the Hamptons? Melissa would say, laughing at some shared memory that excluded everyone else in the room. Your parents' house party when we were 19? You were so determined to impress that investor, and I spent the whole evening rescuing you from embarrassing conversations. Each reminiscence was a small wound, a reminder of all the history Nyla didn't share with Carter, all the experiences she couldn't understand because they belonged to a world she'd never been part of. Worse, she could see the way Carter's face softened when he talked about those times, the ease and comfort he found in discussing the past with someone who'd been there. The breaking point came during a dinner party Helena had organized to celebrate a major business deal Carter had recently closed. The guest list included several board members, their spouses, and of course, Melissa, who had somehow become a regular fixture at family gatherings. Nyla had spent hours preparing for the evening, working with Rosa to choose the right dress, practicing conversations about topics she thought might come up, steeling herself for another night of feeling like an imposter in her own life. The dinner proceeded smoothly at first, with conversations about art, travel, and business that Nyla could follow if not fully participate in. She'd learned to ask thoughtful questions rather than trying to contribute insights she didn't have, and several guests had seemed genuinely interested in her perspective on social issues they'd never considered from her angle. But then the conversation turned to Carter's future with the company, and Helena seized her opportunity. We're so fortunate to have Melissa back in the city, Helena announced, her voice carrying across the dining room. Her experience with international markets will be invaluable as we expand into European operations. Carter looked confused. Melissa's joining the company? Temporarily, Helena replied smoothly. As a consultant. The board felt we needed someone with her particular expertise for the London initiative. Nyla felt her stomach drop as she realized what was happening. Helena was creating reasons for Melissa to be part of Carter's professional life, ensuring that they would spend long hours together working on projects that Nyla couldn't even comprehend, let alone participate in. How wonderful, Melissa said, her smile bright and excited. We'll be working together just like old times. Remember how well we collaborated on your senior thesis? We always did make a good team. The comment was directed at Carter, but Nyla felt its impact like a physical blow. Another shared experience, another bond that excluded her, another reminder that she was the outsider who didn't belong in this carefully constructed world. Carter seemed to sense her distress, reaching under the table to squeeze her hand reassuringly. But even his touch couldn't dispel the growing certainty that she was fighting a battle she couldn't win against opponents who understood the rules of a game she'd never learned to play. The evening continued around her, conversations flowing over and past her like water around a stone. She smiled when expected, nodded at appropriate moments, played her part in Helena's elaborate performance. But inside, she was drowning, suffocated by the weight of expectations she couldn't meet and comparisons she couldn't win. It was when coffee was being served that the conversation took a turn that would change everything. One of the board members, slightly drunk on expensive wine and feeling expansive, began discussing the company's philanthropic initiatives. "We should be doing more in the area of education," he declared. "Corporate responsibility is good for the brand, and there are tax advantages to consider." "What kind of educational programs?" Carter asked, genuine interest replacing the polite attention he'd been giving most of the dinner conversation. "Scholarships, perhaps. Or funding for underprivileged schools. Something that looks good in the annual report and generates positive media coverage." Carter's expression darkened slightly at the casual way human need was being reduced to public relations opportunities, and Nyla saw an opening to contribute something meaningful to the conversation. "What about mentorship programs?" she suggested quietly. "Financial support is important, but sometimes what kids really need is someone who believes in them, who helps them navigate systems they don't understand." The table fell silent, and Nyla realized that everyone was staring at her with expressions ranging from surprise to condescension. She'd overstepped, said too much, revealed too clearly her own background and experiences. "How thoughtful," Helena said with a smile that could have cut glass. "Though I imagine implementing such programs would require expertise in educational policy and nonprofit management. Quite complex undertakings." The dismissal was subtle but devastating, a reminder that good intentions weren't enough when they came from someone without the proper credentials or experience. Nyla felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she realized she'd confirmed every doubt about her suitability for this world. "Actually," Melissa interjected smoothly, "Nyla raises an interesting point. During my time in London, I worked with several organizations that combined financial support with direct mentorship. Very effective programs, though they do require significant infrastructure and professional oversight." The rescue was perfectly executed, transforming Nyla's naive suggestion into something worthy of consideration while simultaneously demonstrating Melissa's superior knowledge and experience. It was kindness and condescension wrapped together so skillfully that rejecting the help would seem ungracious. Carter's hand tightened on Nyla's, and she knew he understood exactly what had just happened. But his loyalty, his desire to protect her, only made her feel worse. She was becoming a burden he had to defend rather than a partner who could stand beside him as an equal. The evening finally ended, with guests departing full of praise for Helena's hospitality and excitement about future business prospects. Melissa was among the last to leave, lingering to discuss some detail about the London project with Carter while Helena supervised the staff cleanup. Nyla escaped to their bedroom, desperate for the privacy to process everything that had happened. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, still in her dinner dress but feeling more exposed than if she'd been naked, when Carter finally joined her. "I'm sorry about tonight," he said immediately, loosening his tie with the sharp movements of someone trying to control his anger. "My mother's behavior was inexcusable, and the board members were insufferable." "They weren't wrong, though," Nyla said quietly. "I don't know enough about business or education policy or international markets. I suggested mentorship programs like an idealistic college student, not someone who understands how these things actually work. Your suggestion was the only one that actually focused on helping people rather than improving our public image," Carter replied fiercely. "You have insights they'll never have because you've lived experiences they can't imagine." "But I can't translate those experiences into the kind of professional expertise that actually creates change," Nyla said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "I'm always going to be the charity case with good intentions but no real qualifications." Carter sat down beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his body but not touching, respecting the invisible barrier her distress had created between them. "Is that really what you think?" he asked softly. "That you're a charity case? Aren't I?" Nyla looked at him directly for the first time since he'd entered the room. Your mother pays my grandmother's medical bills in exchange for me playing the part of your grateful wife. I live in a house I could never afford, wear clothes I could never buy, attend events where I don't belong. What else would you call it?" The question hung between them like a chasm, and Nyla saw Carter struggle with an answer that wouldn't hurt her further while still being honest about the circumstances that had brought them together. "I'd call it the beginning of something that has become far more important than the reasons it started," he said finally. "Our marriage may have begun as an arrangement, but what we've built together is real. The way I feel about you has nothing to do with charity and everything to do with love." The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, creating ripples that neither of them had been prepared for. It was the first time either had spoken directly about love, though the feeling had been growing between them for weeks. "Do you mean that?" Nyla whispered, afraid to hope but unable to stop herself. "I mean it more than I've ever meant anything in my life," Carter replied, reaching for her hand. "I love your compassion, your strength, your refusal to let this world change who you are at heart. I love the way you see possibilities for helping people that I would never think of. I love coming home to someone who cares more about my character than my bank account." The declaration should have been everything she wanted to hear, but instead it filled Nyla with a fear that bordered on panic. Because if Carter loved her, really loved her, then she had the power to destroy him. Helena had made it clear that the board was watching, questioning, looking for reasons to doubt Carter's leadership. How long before their love became the weapon his enemies used against him? "What if loving me costs you everything else?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in her heart since that disastrous brunch. "What if I'm the reason you lose the company, your family, your future?" Carter was quiet for a long moment, and Nyla could see him struggling with the same fears that plagued her. The risks were real, the costs potentially devastating. But when he finally spoke, his voice carried a conviction that took her breath away. "Then I'll build a new future," he said simply. "One where loving you isn't a liability but the foundation everything else is built on." The promise was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, but before Nyla could respond, their conversation was interrupted by the sound of Carter's phone buzzing urgently on the nightstand. He glanced at the screen and his expression immediately shifted to one of concern. "It's Dylan," he said, answering quickly. "What's wrong?" Nyla could only hear Carter's side of the conversation, but his increasingly tense responses told her that something serious was happening. "When did this break?" Carter asked, running his free hand through his hair. "How bad is it? Have you talked to the lawyers?" When he finally hung up, his face was pale and grim. "What happened?" Nyla asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "There's been a story leaked to the press," Carter said heavily. "About offshore accounts tied to Kane Industries. Accounts my mother has been managing without board oversight. The SEC is launching an investigation, and our stock price has already dropped 15% in after-hours trading." The scandal that Helena had been so carefully avoiding with her strategic marriage arrangement had found them anyway, and its timing couldn't have been worse. Just as Carter and Nyla were beginning to believe their love could overcome any obstacle, the very foundation of their world was beginning to crumble beneath them. What neither of them realized was that this crisis would force them to choose not just between love and duty, but between the comfortable lies that had sustained their families for generations and the difficult truths that might destroy everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The real test of their marriage was about to begin, and the stakes had just become higher than either of them had ever imagined possible. Chapter 5 The financial scandal broke across the morning news like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through both the Kane family and the broader business community. By 7 a.m., reporters were gathered outside the mansion gates, their cameras trained on the windows like weapons waiting for a target to appear. Carter had been awake since Dylan's phone call, pacing the length of his home office while fielding calls from lawyers, board members, and crisis management specialists. The offshore accounts in question had been established years earlier under Helena's direction, supposedly for legitimate international business purposes. But the leaked documents suggested a far more complex web of tax avoidance and questionable financial practices that could implicate the entire family in criminal wrongdoing. Nyla watched from the doorway as her husband transformed before her eyes from the gentleman she'd fallen in love with into the strategic businessman she'd heard about but never truly seen. His voice was crisp and controlled as he issued instructions, demanded information, and began building the defensive strategy that might save his family's company from complete destruction. "The board is calling an emergency meeting for this afternoon," Carter told her when he finally hung up from what felt like the 100th call of the morning. "They want a full accounting of every transaction, every decision, every email that might be relevant to the investigation." "What does this mean for you?" Nyla asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "It means my position as CEO is in immediate jeopardy," Carter replied honestly. "If the board determines that I knew about these accounts, or should have known, they'll have grounds to remove me from leadership. And even if they find no evidence of my involvement, the scandal could still force them to make changes to restore investor confidence." The irony of Helena's warnings about Nyla being a distraction wasn't lost on either of them. While Carter's mother had been orchestrating social pressures designed to undermine his marriage, she'd been engaging in the very behaviors that truly threatened his professional future. Helena herself had been conspicuously absent since the news broke, having departed the house before dawn with only a terse note explaining that she was meeting with attorneys and would be unreachable for the foreseeable future. Her abandonment of both Carter and the crisis she'd created was perhaps the clearest indication yet of where her true loyalties lay. "I should go," Nyla said quietly as Carter prepared to leave for the emergency board meeting. "Pack my things and move back to my apartment until this is resolved." Carter's head snapped up, his attention fully focused on her for the first time all morning. "Why would you do that?" "Because your mother was right about one thing," Nyla replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart was breaking. "The board needs to see that your priorities are with the company, not with personal distractions. If I'm not here, if we're separated, it might help convince them that you're fully committed to fixing this mess." "Absolutely not," Carter said firmly, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "Nyla, I don't care what the board thinks about my marriage. I'm not sacrificing my relationship with you to appease people who are probably more concerned about their own liability than they are about justice." "But what if staying together costs you the company?" Nyla pressed. "What if choosing me means losing everything your grandfather built?" Carter was quiet for a moment, and she could see him struggling with the weight of generations of family legacy. When he finally spoke, his words carried a conviction that surprised them both. "My grandfather built that company to create something meaningful, something that would improve people's lives," he said slowly. "If keeping it means betraying the person I love most in the world, then it's already lost everything that made it worth preserving in the first place." The declaration was everything Nyla had hoped to hear, but it also filled her with a terror she couldn't name. She was watching Carter risk everything for her, and the responsibility felt crushing. What if she wasn't worth the sacrifice? What if their love, however real it felt, wasn't strong enough to survive the destruction of everything else he valued? The board meeting lasted 8 hours, and by the time Carter returned home that evening, he looked like he'd aged years in a single day. The grilling had been thorough and brutal, with every decision he'd made as CEO subjected to intense scrutiny and second-guessing. "How bad is it?" Nyla asked as he collapsed into his favorite chair in the library, still wearing his suit but looking utterly defeated. "They're suspending me pending the outcome of the SEC investigation," Carter said flatly. "Melissa will serve as interim CEO while they determine whether I had any knowledge of my mother's activities." The news hit Nyla like a physical blow. Not only was Carter losing his position, but it was being given to the woman who represented everything Nyla could never be. The symbolism was devastating, a public demonstration that Melissa was the kind of person the board trusted to lead the company through crisis while Carter's judgment was considered compromised. "I'm sorry," Nyla whispered, the words feeling inadequate in the face of such massive loss. "Don't apologize for my mother's crimes," Carter replied sharply, then immediately softened his tone. I'm sorry. This isn't your fault, and I shouldn't take my anger out on you. But the damage was done. The stress, the scandal, the professional humiliation, it was all taking its toll on both of them, creating cracks in the foundation they'd worked so hard to build together. Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified from every direction. Media attention remained constant, with reporters camped outside their home and photographers following them whenever they ventured out. Social invitations dried up as their former associates distanced themselves from the scandal. Even the household staff began treating them with the careful politeness reserved for employers whose positions were no longer secure. Melissa's presence in Carter's former office became a constant reminder of how quickly circumstances could change. She handled the role with the competence and confidence everyone expected, making decisions that Carter had been making just weeks earlier while he sat at home, effectively powerless to influence the future of the company he'd dedicated his life to. The investigation proceeded with agonizing slowness, each day bringing new revelations about Helena's financial manipulations while providing no clarity about when or how the situation might be resolved. Carter threw himself into preparing his defense, working with lawyers to document his ignorance of his mother's activities while Nyla watched helplessly as the man she loved disappeared beneath layers of legal strategy and professional survival. Their conversations became stilted, focused on practical matters rather than the emotional intimacy they'd been building. They slept in the same bed but barely touched, each afraid that reaching for the other might be seen as selfish given the magnitude of the crisis they were facing. It was during this period of mounting tension that Nyla received the phone call that would change everything. "Miss Monroe?" The voice on the other end was professional but concerned. "This is Dr. Sarah Chen from Mount Sinai Hospital. I'm calling about your grandmother, Ruth Washington." Nyla's heart stopped. "Is she okay? What's happened?" "She's stable, but we had to bring her to the emergency room this morning. She's been experiencing complications from her treatment, and we need to discuss some changes to her care plan. Can you come in as soon as possible?" The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of fear and self-recrimination. Nyla had been so consumed with her marriage drama that she'd been neglecting the person whose life had prompted all these sacrifices in the first place. Mama Ruth had seemed to be responding well to treatment, but cancer was unpredictable, and Nyla should have been paying closer attention. She found her grandmother in a private room that spoke clearly of the Kane family's financial influence. The medical equipment was state-of-the-art, the accommodations luxurious by hospital standards, and the nursing staff was attentive and professional. But beneath all the expensive care, Mama Ruth looked smaller and more fragile than Nyla had ever seen her. "There's my beautiful girl," Mama Ruth said softly when Nyla entered the room, her voice weak but warm. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." "I should have been here more," Nyla said, settling into the chair beside the bed and taking her grandmother's hand. "I should have been taking better care of you. Child, you gave me the best care possible when you married that boy," Mama Ruth replied firmly. "The doctors here, the treatments, the room, none of this would have been possible without what you did. You saved my life. But at what cost?" Nyla asked, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "Carter's lost his job, his family's company is under investigation, his mother has disappeared rather than face the consequences of what she did. I've ruined everything for him." Mama Ruth studied her granddaughter's face with the shrewd intelligence that had guided Nyla through every crisis of her life. "And how does Carter feel about all that?" "He says it doesn't matter, that he'd rather have me than the company," Nyla replied. "But how can that be true? He's losing everything that defined him, everything he worked for. Or maybe," Mama Ruth said gently, "he's learning what really defines him. Maybe this crisis is showing him what actually matters, what's worth fighting for when everything else is stripped away." Before Nyla could respond, she heard familiar footsteps in the hallway. Carter appeared in the doorway, still wearing his business attire but looking harried and concerned. "I came as soon as I got your message," he said, approaching the bed with genuine worry. How are you feeling, Mrs. Washington? Better now that you're both here, Mama Ruth replied, and Nyla was surprised to see her grandmother's eyes brighten at Carter's presence. Sit down, young man. I want to talk to both of you. Carter settled into the chair on the opposite side of the bed, and Nyla noticed how naturally he took Mama Ruth's other hand, how comfortable he seemed in this sterile environment that was so different from the luxury he'd grown up with. I've been watching you two these past months, Mama Ruth began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. And I've seen something beautiful growing between you, something real and precious. But I've also seen fear trying to poison it. Fear of what? Carter asked quietly. Fear that love isn't enough, Mama Ruth replied. Fear that circumstances are stronger than choice, that outside pressures can destroy what two people build together if they're determined enough to preserve it. She looked between them with the wisdom of someone who'd survived decades of hardship without losing her faith in human goodness. I want to tell you something about your grandfather, Carter. We never met, but I know about him through what Nyla has shared, through the values you carry that must have come from somewhere. Carter leaned forward, surprised by the unexpected direction of the conversation. Nyla told me he believed that wealth was a responsibility, not a privilege, Mama Ruth continued. That it should be used to make the world better, not just to accumulate more wealth. Do you think he would be proud of the company as it exists today, or would he be proud of a man who chose to build something new based on those principles? The question hit Carter like a revelation, forcing him to consider his grandfather's legacy from an entirely new perspective. Had he been fighting to preserve something that had already lost its soul, or was this crisis an opportunity to reclaim the values that had inspired its creation in the first place? I think, Carter said slowly, he would want me to choose authenticity over appearance, substance over status. And what about you, baby girl? Mama Ruth turned to Nyla with gentle but piercing eyes. What do you think your grandfather would want for you? A life spent apologizing for who you are, or a life spent becoming everything you're capable of being? Nyla had never known her grandfather, but she'd grown up on stories of his quiet dignity, his refusal to let poverty define his worth, his belief that every person deserved respect regardless of their circumstances. She realized with sudden clarity that by constantly doubting her place in Carter's world, she was betraying everything he'd taught her through Mama Ruth's stories. He'd want me to stop being afraid of taking up space, she said quietly. To stop apologizing for having needs and dreams and opinions that matter. That's right, Mama Ruth said firmly. And he'd want you both to understand that real wealth isn't what you own or where you come from. It's who you choose to be when life tests everything you think you believe about yourself. As if summoned by her words, the sky outside began to darken with the promise of an approaching storm. What had been a clear afternoon was rapidly becoming something more dramatic, with thunder rumbling in the distance and the first drops of rain beginning to streak the hospital windows. I should get you home before this gets worse, Carter said, glancing at the threatening sky. But Mama Ruth wasn't finished with them yet. Before you go, she said, reaching into the bedside table drawer, I want to give you something. She pulled out a small, worn jewelry box that Nyla recognized from her childhood. Inside was a simple gold band, worn smooth by decades of wear but still beautiful in its simplicity. This was my wedding ring, Mama Ruth explained. 52 years I wore it, through poverty and sickness and times when we didn't know how we'd make it through another day. But love carried us through all of it, love and the choice to keep choosing each other no matter what the world threw at us. She held the ring out to Nyla with trembling hands. I want you to have it, not to replace what Carter gave you, but to remember that real marriage isn't about fancy ceremonies or perfect circumstances. It's about two people deciding that whatever comes, they'll face it together. Nyla took the ring with tears streaming down her face, feeling the weight of generations of love and commitment in the simple gold band. But it was Carter's reaction that surprised her most. He was staring at the ring with an expression of wonder, as if he was seeing something he'd never noticed before. May I? He asked quietly, and when Nyla nodded, he took the ring and examined it carefully. This is beautiful. You can see the history in it, the life it's lived. It's worth more than any diamond because of what it represents. Now you're beginning to understand, Mama Ruth said with satisfaction. Real value comes from what survives when everything else falls away. They stayed with Mama Ruth until the evening shift arrived, talking about everything and nothing, rebuilding the connections that had been strained by weeks of crisis and uncertainty. When they finally left the hospital, the storm that had been threatening all afternoon was in full force, with sheets of rain turning the city streets into rivers. "We should wait it out," Carter suggested as they reached the hospital entrance, but Nyla was already pushing through the doors into the deluge. "No," she said firmly. "I'm tired of waiting for things to get better. I'm tired of being afraid of what might happen. Let's go home." The drive through the storm was treacherous, but neither of them suggested stopping. There was something cathartic about moving through the chaos, about refusing to be paralyzed by circumstances beyond their control. When they finally reached the mansion, both were soaked despite the brief sprint from the car to the front door. But instead of going inside immediately, Nyla found herself drawn to the garden, to the gazebo where she'd found peace during some of her most difficult moments since joining the Kane family. "Nyla, you'll catch pneumonia," Carter called after her, but she was already running through the rain toward the small shelter tucked among the rose bushes. By the time they reached the gazebo, both were completely drenched, their expensive clothes clinging to their bodies as they gasped and laughed from the exhilaration of running through the storm. The gazebo provided shelter from the worst of the rain, but the air was still charged with electricity, still crackling with the power of the storm raging around them. It was then, in that rain-soaked sanctuary, that they finally said the words that had been building between them for weeks. "I need to tell you something," Nyla began, her voice barely audible above the thunder. "Something I should have said weeks ago." Carter moved closer, close enough that she could see the water droplets on his eyelashes, close enough to feel the warmth of his body despite their soaked clothing. "What is it?" he asked softly. "My mother didn't die from natural causes," Nyla said, the words coming out in a rush. "She died because she was working 3 jobs trying to escape poverty, trying to give me a better life than she'd had. She collapsed from exhaustion at her 3rd job, cleaning offices at 2 in the morning because that was the only shift she could fit around her other work." The revelation hung between them like a physical presence, and Carter could see the pain that Nyla had been carrying, the guilt that had been eating at her since their marriage began. "She died trying to be enough," Nyla continued, tears mixing with rainwater on her cheeks. "Trying to prove that we deserved better than what we had. And ever since I married you, I've been terrified that I'm just like her, that I'll never be enough for this world you come from, that people will always see me as the charity case who doesn't belong." Carter felt his heart break for her, for the burden she'd been carrying alone, for the way their society had made her feel ashamed of circumstances beyond her control. "And I need to tell you something too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Something I've never told anyone, not even Dylan." Nyla looked up at him, seeing something raw and vulnerable in his expression that she'd never witnessed before. "My father didn't die from a heart attack like the obituary said," Carter confessed. "He killed himself. Left a note saying he couldn't live with the pressure anymore, couldn't handle being responsible for so many people's livelihoods when he felt like a fraud who was only succeeding because of his family name." The admission hung in the air between them, 2 secrets that revealed the deepest wounds each had been carrying. "I found the note," Carter continued. "I was 17, and I found it before anyone else could see it. I destroyed it because I thought I was protecting the family's reputation, but really I was just protecting myself from having to face the truth about what wealth and pressure had done to him." "That's why you're so afraid of disappointing people," Nyla said softly, understanding flooding through her. "Why you've been so worried about losing the company. And that's why you're so afraid of not being enough," Carter replied, cupping her face gently with his hands. "Because you watched your mother sacrifice everything for the chance to prove her worth, and you're terrified the same thing will happen to you." They stood there in the gazebo, rain drumming on the roof above them, lightning illuminating their faces as they finally understood each other completely. All the fears, all the insecurities, all the ways they'd been afraid to trust their own feelings, it all made sense now. "We're both running from ghosts," Nyla whispered. "Maybe it's time to stop running," Carter replied, his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her cheeks. "Maybe it's time to build something new, something that honors our family's sacrifices without repeating their mistakes." The kiss that followed was nothing like their wedding kiss or the careful affection they'd shared in recent weeks. This was desperate and hungry and full of all the emotions they'd been holding back, all the love and fear and hope that had been building between them since that first night when he'd asked what she needed. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the storm was beginning to clear, leaving behind the fresh, clean scent of rain-washed earth and the promise of new growth. "What happens now?" Nyla asked, still wrapped in Carter's arms. "Now we stop apologizing for who we are," Carter said firmly. "We stop trying to meet other people's expectations and start building something based on our own values. We make choices that honor the people we love without sacrificing the love we've found with each other. Even if it means losing everything else?" Nyla asked. "Especially then," Carter replied. "Because everything else doesn't matter if we lose each other in the process of trying to save it." As they walked back to the house through the clearing rain, both felt something fundamental had shifted between them. The crisis wasn't over, the investigation would continue, difficult decisions lay ahead, and their future remained uncertain. But they were no longer facing it as two people afraid of disappointing each other. They were facing it as partners who had finally learned to trust not just in their love, but in their own worth. The revelation that would change everything was about to unfold, but for the first time since the scandal broke, both Carter and Nyla felt ready to face whatever came next together. Chapter 6. The morning after the storm brought an unexpected visitor to the Kane mansion. Carter was in the kitchen making coffee, a simple pleasure he discovered since marrying Nyla, when Rosa announced that Helena had returned, accompanied by her attorney and demanding an immediate family meeting. Carter found his mother in the formal living room, impeccably dressed as always but with something brittle in her composure that hadn't been there before. The weeks of investigation had taken their toll on her as well, though she wore her stress like armor, refusing to show any vulnerability that might be interpreted as weakness. "Carter, darling," she said, rising to embrace him with the careful affection of someone performing for an audience. "You look tired. This whole situation has been so stressful for everyone." "Where have you been, Mother?" Carter asked, not returning her embrace. "The board has been asking questions I can't answer because you disappeared without explanation. I've been working with legal counsel to resolve this unfortunate misunderstanding," Helena replied smoothly, settling back into her chair with practiced grace. "And I believe we've found a solution that will benefit everyone involved." Nyla entered the room at that moment, having sensed from the tension in the household that something significant was happening. Helena's eyes flickered over her with the same calculating assessment she might give a piece of furniture she was considering discarding. "Nyla, dear, how convenient," Helena said with a smile that carried no warmth. "This concerns you as well." Carter moved instinctively closer to his wife, and Helena noticed the protective gesture with obvious displeasure. "The SEC investigation can be resolved," Helena announced without preamble. "The offshore accounts in question were established for legitimate business purposes, and we have documentation to prove it. However, there are conditions that must be met to avoid criminal charges." "What kind of conditions?" Carter asked, though something in his mother's expression warned him he wouldn't like the answer. "The board has agreed to reinstate you as CEO," Helena continued, "but only if certain assurances can be provided about your commitment to the company's future. They need to see that your judgment hasn't been compromised by personal entanglements that might affect your professional decision-making." The euphemism hung in the air like poison, and Carter felt his jaw clench with suppressed anger. "And what assurances are they looking for?" Helena's smile became sharper, more predatory. "A dissolution of your marriage to Nyla, effective immediately." In exchange, her grandmother's medical care will continue to be provided, along with a generous settlement that will ensure her financial security for life. The proposal hit the room like a physical blow. Nyla felt the breath leave her lungs as she realized Helena was offering her exactly what she'd originally agreed to, financial security for herself and Mama Ruth, but now it felt like a betrayal of everything she and Carter had built together. "You're asking me to divorce my wife to get my job back," Carter said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm offering you a return to the life you were meant to live," Helena corrected. CEO of Kane Industries, married to someone appropriate like Melissa, building the legacy your grandfather intended. This marriage was always meant to be temporary, Carter. I'm simply providing you with a graceful exit. Carter looked at Nyla, seeing the pain in her eyes and knowing that part of her was probably wondering if this was what he secretly wanted. An escape from the complications their love had created, a return to the easier path where his success didn't depend on fighting battles he might not win. "And if I refuse?" Carter asked. Helena's mask slipped slightly, revealing the cold calculation beneath her maternal facade. "Then the SEC investigation will proceed, criminal charges will likely be filed, and you'll lose the company anyway. Along with your reputation, your inheritance, and any hope of building the kind of life you deserve." The ultimatum was elegantly delivered but brutally clear. Carter could have everything he'd worked for, everything he'd been raised to value, if he was willing to sacrifice the one thing that had taught him what really mattered. "I need to think about this," Carter said finally. "Of course," Helena agreed. "But don't take too long. The board meets again tomorrow morning, and they'll need an answer." After Helena left, Carter and Nyla sat in their bedroom in shell-shocked silence, each processing the impossible choice that had been laid before them. "She's offering you everything you've lost," Nyla said quietly. "Your job, your inheritance, your mother's approval. All you have to do is give up me." "It's not that simple," Carter replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" Nyla looked at him directly, her eyes filled with love and pain in equal measure. "Carter, I've watched what losing the company has done to you. You've been miserable, frustrated, feeling like you're failing everyone who depends on you. If taking Helena's deal gives you back your purpose, your ability to make a difference in the world, you think I should take it?" Carter asked, surprised by the suggestion. "I think," Nyla said carefully, "that I love you enough to want you to be happy, even if that happiness doesn't include me." The words were intended as a gift, a sacrifice born of love, but they hit Carter like a slap. The idea that Nyla still saw herself as expendable, still believed her worth was secondary to his comfort, showed him how far they still had to go in building the kind of partnership he actually wanted. "Do you remember what you told me about your mother?" Carter asked suddenly. "About how she died trying to prove she was enough?" Nyla nodded, confused by the change of direction. "And do you remember what I told you about my father? About how he killed himself because he couldn't handle the pressure of living up to other people's expectations?" "Yes, but I don't understand. I'm not going to repeat their mistakes," Carter said firmly, taking her hands in his. "I'm not going to sacrifice our love for other people's approval, and I'm not going to let you sacrifice yourself for my supposed happiness." He stood up and began pacing the room, his decision crystallizing with each step. "My grandfather didn't build that company so his descendants could use it as leverage to control each other's lives," Carter continued. "He built it to create something meaningful, something that would make the world better. If the only way to keep it requires me to betray everything I actually believe in, then it's already lost its purpose." "But what will you do?" Nyla asked. "How will you support yourself, build a career, make the kind of impact you want to make?" Carter stopped pacing and looked at her with a smile that was both determined and peaceful. "We'll figure it out together. We'll build something new, something based on the values we actually share instead of the expectations other people have placed on us." The next morning, Carter walked into the boardroom at Kane Industries for what he knew would be the last time as a member of the family. Helena was already there, along with the board members who would decide his fate, and Melissa, who sat in the CEO's chair with the calm confidence of someone who had already won. "Have you made your decision?" Helena asked without preamble. "I have," Carter replied, standing at the head of the table where he'd once commanded respect but now felt like a stranger. "I'm resigning from Kane Industries, effective immediately." The announcement sent ripples of shock through the room. This wasn't one of the options Helena had offered, wasn't part of the carefully scripted resolution she'd orchestrated. "Carter, don't be dramatic," Helena said, her composure beginning to crack. "Think about what you're throwing away." "I'm not throwing anything away," Carter replied calmly. "I'm choosing to build something based on integrity instead of compromising my values for convenience." He turned to address the full board, his voice carrying the authority and conviction that had made him an effective leader. "The offshore accounts my mother established may have been technically legal, but they represent exactly the kind of ethical shortcuts that corrode public trust in business institutions. If this company wants to truly honor my grandfather's legacy, it should be leading by example, not finding creative ways to avoid its responsibilities." "You're making a mistake," Melissa said softly, and Carter could hear genuine regret in her voice. "You're letting emotion cloud your judgment." "For the first time in my life, I'm letting my judgment be guided by something more substantial than other people's expectations," Carter replied. "I'm choosing authenticity over appearance, love over obligation." He looked directly at Helena, seeing her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. "I'll always be grateful for the opportunities this family gave me," he said. "But I won't sacrifice my integrity or my marriage to preserve them." With that, Carter turned and walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind the life he'd been groomed for since childhood but feeling freer than he had in years. 6 months later, Nyla stood in the sunlit office space that she and Carter had chosen for their new venture, watching him put the finishing touches on a presentation for their first major client. The space was smaller than his former office, located in a converted warehouse rather than a gleaming skyscraper, but it buzzed with an energy and purpose that had been missing from his previous work. Kane Consulting specialized in helping businesses develop ethical practices and social responsibility programs, combining Carter's strategic expertise with Nyla's insights into the communities these companies claimed to serve. They'd started with nothing but their shared vision and Carter's severance package, but word had spread quickly about their innovative approach to corporate responsibility. "How do I look?" Carter asked, adjusting his tie nervously. The presentation was for a major retailer interested in developing fair trade partnerships with overseas suppliers, and success could establish their firm as a serious player in the consulting world. "Like someone who's exactly where he's supposed to be," Nyla replied honestly. In the months since leaving Kane Industries, Carter had shed the careful composure that had defined his previous life, replacing it with genuine enthusiasm for work that aligned with his values. "We make a good team," Carter said, pulling her close for a quick kiss before the client arrived. "Yes, we do," Nyla agreed, but her attention was caught by the ringing of her phone. The caller ID showed Mount Sinai Hospital, and her heart rate immediately accelerated. "Dr. Chen," she answered, motioning for Carter to listen as well. "Nyla, I have wonderful news," the doctor's voice was warm with genuine pleasure. "Your grandmother's latest scans show no signs of active cancer. She's officially in remission." The news hit them both like a lightning bolt of pure joy. All the sacrifices, all the struggles, all the impossible choices, they had led to this moment of triumph. "Can we see her?" Nyla asked through tears she didn't bother to hide. "She's asking for both of you," Dr. Chen replied. "And she has something she wants to discuss about her future care." They found Mama Ruth sitting up in bed, looking stronger and more vibrant than she had in months. The cancer treatments had taken their toll, but there was a light in her eyes that spoke of renewed hope and determination. "There are my beautiful children," she said as they entered the room, and Carter felt his heart swell at being included in that endearment. "Come here and give your Mama Ruth some love." As they embraced her, Nyla felt overwhelmed by gratitude not just for her grandmother's recovery, but for the journey that had brought all three of them to this moment. The marriage that had begun as a desperate bargain had become the foundation for a family built on choice rather than obligation. "I've been talking to the doctors about next steps," Mama Ruth announced once they were settled in chairs beside her bed. "And I've made a decision about where I want to spend my recovery time." "Whatever you need," Nyla said immediately. "We can arrange for the best care, whatever makes you most comfortable." "What would make me most comfortable," Mama Ruth said with a smile that held decades of wisdom, "is moving in with my granddaughter and her husband, if they'll have an old woman cluttering up their new life together." The offer was everything Nyla had hoped for but hadn't dared to ask. She looked at Carter, expecting to see polite acceptance of an obligation, but instead found genuine enthusiasm. "We'd love to have you," Carter said without hesitation. "The house has plenty of room, and honestly, Nyla's been worried about you living alone during recovery anyway." "Are you sure?" Nyla asked, wanting to be certain he understood what he was agreeing to. "Mama Ruth has opinions about everything from politics to cooking, and she's not shy about sharing them." "Good," Carter replied firmly. "Our house could use some opinions that aren't based on stock prices and social status." As they discussed practical arrangements for Mama Ruth's move, Nyla felt the final piece of her new life clicking into place. She had her grandmother's recovery, a marriage built on genuine love and respect, and work that gave her purpose beyond simple survival. It wasn't the fairy tale she'd dreamed of as a girl, but it was something better, a reality built on authentic choices and mutual support. That evening, as they drove home through the city where they'd both been born but where they'd never truly belonged until they found each other, Carter reached over to take Nyla's hand. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "The way everything happened, all the chaos and struggle?" Nyla considered the question seriously, thinking about the path that had led them from that desperate contract signing to this moment of complete contentment. "I regret that it took crisis to show us what really mattered," she said finally. "But I don't regret a single choice we made once we started choosing each other over everyone else's expectations." "Even when I lost the company?" Carter pressed. "Especially then," Nyla replied. "That's when I knew that what we had was real, that you loved me for who I am rather than what I could do for your image." They drove the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, both reflecting on how completely their lives had been transformed. The mansion they returned to was the same building where their marriage had begun, but it felt entirely different now, a home rather than a stage, a sanctuary rather than a performance space. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in the room they'd shared through every stage of their relationship, Nyla found herself thinking about the wedding night that had started everything. How terrified she'd been, how certain that Carter would demand things she wasn't ready to give. "Do you remember that first night?" she asked as they settled under the covers. "When you asked what I needed instead of demanding what you wanted?" "Best decision I ever made," Carter replied, pulling her close. "Though I have to admit, I was terrified I was doing everything wrong." "You were doing everything right," Nyla said softly. "You showed me that love could be gentle, that marriage could be a partnership instead of a conquest." The intimacy that followed was everything their wedding night hadn't been, gentle but passionate, tender but consuming, a celebration of everything they'd built together and overcome together. In the gazebo where they'd first revealed their deepest fears, they discovered that vulnerability could be a source of strength. In their bed, they discovered that complete trust could transform physical connection into something transcendent. As moonlight streamed through the windows, illuminating their intertwined bodies and peaceful faces, both felt the deep satisfaction of people who had fought for their happiness and won. They'd learned that love worth having was love worth fighting for, that authentic partnership required courage but offered rewards beyond anything they'd ever imagined. The poor girl who'd been forced to marry a rich heir had discovered that her worth had never depended on anyone else's approval. The rich heir who'd been trapped by expectations had learned that real wealth came from relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection. What Carter had done on their wedding night. Asking what she needed instead of demanding what he wanted, had broken every expectation about arranged marriages, about power dynamics between men and women, about what it meant to choose love over convenience. But it had also created something neither of them had dared to hope for. A marriage that would grow stronger with each challenge they faced together, a love that would transform them both into the best versions of themselves, and a partnership that would serve as proof that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve others and build something meaningful together. But tonight, wrapped in each other's arms and surrounded by the peace they'd fought so hard to create, they were simply two people who had learned that the greatest luxury in life wasn't wealth or status or social approval. It was the luxury of being completely known and completely loved by someone who had chosen you, and who would keep choosing you, every single day for the rest of your lives. Chapter 7. 1 year later, on a warm evening that carried the promise of summer, Nyla found herself walking through the garden that had become her sanctuary. The roses were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air with sweetness, and the gazebo where she and Carter had weathered their first real storm together beckoned like an old friend. Carter was already there, having arrived early with a bottle of champagne and a picnic basket Rosa had helped him pack. Tonight marked the anniversary of the thunderstorm that had changed everything between them, the night they'd finally stopped hiding from their fears and started building something real together. "You remembered," Nyla said softly as she approached, seeing the careful way he'd arranged cushions and candles to recreate the intimacy of that stormy evening. "How could I forget the night my wife finally trusted me with her heart?" Carter replied, rising to embrace her as she entered the gazebo. "The night we both stopped being afraid of what we might lose and started celebrating what we'd found." The year between then and now had been filled with challenges and triumphs in equal measure. Their consulting firm had grown beyond their wildest expectations, with clients seeking their expertise in creating authentic corporate responsibility programs. Mama Ruth had not only recovered fully but had become an unofficial grandmother to half their staff, dispensing wisdom and home-cooked meals with equal generosity. Most importantly, their marriage had deepened into something neither had believed possible when they'd signed that original contract. "I have something for you," Carter said, producing a small wrapped package from the picnic basket. "It's not much, but I wanted to mark this anniversary with something that represents what this past year has meant to me." Nyla unwrapped the gift carefully, gasping when she saw what lay inside. It was a photograph, professionally taken but candid in feeling, showing the three of them, Carter, Nyla, and Mama Ruth, working together in the garden on a sunny afternoon. All three were laughing at something off camera, their faces radiant with the kind of happiness that can't be posed or manufactured. "When did you have this taken?" Nyla asked, studying the image that captured not just their faces but the love and contentment that surrounded them. "Last month, when you thought I was on a conference call," Carter admitted with a sheepish smile. "I wanted to capture this moment in our lives, this feeling of everything being exactly as it should be." The gift was perfect in its simplicity, a reminder that the most precious things in life couldn't be bought but could be chosen, cultivated, and cherished. As Nyla traced the faces in the photograph, she marveled at how much had changed since that desperate night when she'd first agreed to marry a stranger for money. "I have something for you too," she said, reaching into her purse for her own carefully chosen gift. "Though mine is less tangible than yours." She handed him an envelope, and Carter opened it to find a letter written in Nyla's careful handwriting. As he read, his expression shifted from curiosity to wonder to something approaching awe. The letter was an acceptance notice from Columbia University's Graduate School of Social Work, informing Nyla that she'd been admitted to their prestigious program with a full scholarship. More than that, it was proof that she'd stopped apologizing for her dreams and started pursuing them with the same courage she'd shown in everything else. "When did you apply?" Carter asked, his voice thick with pride and emotion. 3 months ago, Nyla replied. "I kept thinking about what Mama Ruth said, about becoming everything I'm capable of being instead of shrinking myself to fit other people's expectations. I realized I could use my experiences, everything I've learned about navigating between different worlds, to help other people who are facing impossible choices." Carter set the letter aside and pulled her close, his heart overflowing with love for this woman who continued to amaze him with her strength and determination. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered against her hair. "And I'm so grateful that I get to watch you become everything you're meant to be." As the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they settled onto the cushions Carter had arranged, sharing the simple meal Rosa had prepared and talking about their plans for the future. The conversation meandered from practical concerns about managing Nyla's school schedule with their business responsibilities to dreams about the kind of legacy they wanted to build together. "Do you think we'll have children someday?" Nyla asked as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "I hope so," Carter replied honestly. "But only if we can raise them to value authenticity over appearance, compassion over competition. Children who know that their worth isn't determined by their bank account or their social status," Nyla added, thinking about the lessons she'd learned from both her own struggles and Carter's privileged but emotionally impoverished upbringing. "Children who understand that real wealth comes from the courage to love completely and be loved in return," Carter concluded, his arm tightening around her shoulders. As the evening deepened and the candles Carter had lit began to flicker in the gentle breeze, their conversation grew softer, more intimate, filled with the kind of shared silence that only comes when two people are completely comfortable with each other. When Carter finally leaned down to kiss her, it was with all the tenderness and passion that had been building between them throughout the day, throughout the year, throughout every moment since that first night when he'd chosen to ask what she needed instead of demanding what he wanted. The intimacy that followed was a celebration of everything they'd overcome and everything they'd built together. Under the same stars that had witnessed their first vulnerable conversation, surrounded by the scent of roses and the sound of night birds calling to each other across the garden, they came together with the reverent joy of two people who had learned that love, real love, was the greatest privilege either of them would ever experience. Their physical connection had evolved alongside their emotional one, deepening from tentative exploration to confident partnership to something that transcended the merely physical. In each other's arms, they found not just pleasure but completion, not just passion but peace, not just satisfaction but the profound contentment that comes from being completely known and completely accepted. As they lay together afterward, Nyla's head on Carter's chest and his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, both reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. "Thank you," Nyla whispered into the darkness. "For what?" Carter asked softly. "For seeing me," she replied. "For asking what I needed instead of assuming what I should want. For choosing me even when it meant risking everything else." "Thank you," Carter said in return, "for teaching me what it means to be brave. For showing me that real strength comes from vulnerability, that real wealth comes from connection, that real success comes from building something meaningful with someone you love." The themes that had defined their story, the triumph of authenticity over appearance, the power of choosing love over obligation, the discovery that true worth comes from character rather than circumstances, had become the foundation not just of their marriage but of the life they were building together. Nyla had learned that being poor had never made her less valuable, just as Carter had learned that being wealthy had never made him more worthy. They'd both discovered that real partnership meant supporting each other's growth rather than trying to change each other, that genuine love required courage but offered rewards beyond anything money could buy. Their story was proof that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings, that arranged marriages could become love stories when both people chose to see past surface circumstances to the deeper truths of character and heart. Most importantly, they'd learned that happiness wasn't something that happened to them but something they created together, day by day, choice by choice, moment by moment of choosing each other over every other option the world presented. As the night deepened around them and the gazebo became their private sanctuary once again, both knew that this anniversary was not just a celebration of their past but a promise for their future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, and there would be challenges, because that's what life brings to everyone regardless of their bank account, they would face them together, with the kind of partnership that transforms obstacles into opportunities for deeper connection. The poor girl who had been forced to marry a rich heir had discovered that she was neither poor in the ways that mattered nor forced to be anyone other than exactly who she was meant to be. The rich heir who had been trapped by expectations had learned that real wealth came not from inheritance but from the courage to build something authentic with someone who loved him for who he chose to be rather than what he'd been born to represent. Their love story would continue long past this perfect evening, through graduate school and career changes, through the expansion of their business and the growth of their family, through all the joys and sorrows and ordinary miracles that fill a life well lived. But it had begun on a wedding night when Carter Kane had done something that broke every expectation about arranged marriages, about power dynamics, about what it means to choose love over convenience. He had asked his terrified bride what she needed instead of demanding what he wanted. And in that simple question, he had created space for something beautiful to grow between two people who had learned that the greatest luxury in life isn't wealth or status or social approval. It's the luxury of being completely known and completely loved by someone who chooses you, and who will keep choosing you, every single day for the rest of your lives. Nyla and Carter's story reminds us that our worth isn't determined by our circumstances, but by our courage to remain authentic and open to love. Their journey from strangers bound by necessity to partners united by choice proves that real connection transcends every external barrier when two people are brave enough to see and accept each other completely. Have you ever discovered that someone you initially misunderstood became someone precious to you? What's your experience with love that surprised you by breaking all your expectations? Maybe you found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between what others expected and what your heart knew was right. Nyla and Carter's transformation shows us that sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest gifts, that the people who enter our lives during our darkest moments might just be the ones who help us find our light. Their story proves that authentic love, the kind that sees past surface appearances to the beautiful soul beneath, has the power to transform not just individual lives but entire legacies. Share your own story of unexpected love or connection that changed your perspective in the comments below. Your experiences matter to our community, and you never know whose heart your story might touch. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to join our Dear Love Diaries family. Hit that notification bell so you'll be the first to know when we share another story of hearts finding each other against impossible odds.